Danielle Outlaw swept into Portland less than 3 years ago with her eyes on the prize. The first African-American woman to lead the police bureau said she wanted to repair the law enforcement agency's strained relationship with the community, enact reforms mandated by the Federal Justice Department, and provide a steady hand to a bureau with a rotating cast of chiefs in recent years. Mayor Ted Wheeler proclaimed he'd found a partner in a dynamic chief for the long haul. By December 30th, Outlaw was gone, hired as Philadelphia's new police chief. On to the next challenge. I'm Andrew Thien, and this is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Up next, a conversation with Maxine Bernstein, who's covered every Portland police chief, and there have been a lot of them since 1998. We talked about how Max broke the story about Outlaw's departure, what her legacy is in Portland, and what to expect from the new chief, Jamie Resch. Max, thanks for taking the time to come on the podcast. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Where were you when you first got word that Chief Danielle Outlaw was leaving Portland?
Do you really want to know?
I do.
It was last Monday. I was supposed to be off that week after working Christmas Eve and the evening of Christmas. So I took the whole week off, and that Monday was supposed to be the nicest day for skiing at Mount Hood. So my sons and family, we were all going to go skiing. So we were up, we had breakfast, we had all our gear in the car, just had my backpack, everything was packed, we were all set to go, and then my cell phone rings, and it's a source who tells me, this is urgent. Outlaw took a job for Philadelphia as Philadelphia Police Commissioner.
Wow.
So all my kids are like, Mom, we got to go. You're off. And I grabbed my laptop, called my editor, Margaret Haberman, and told her and said I would write something up on the way to the mountain. And then others who are working would have to chip in and assist. And so I was in the back seat with my laptop writing the story. And
headed up Highway 26.
Headed up, and my self-imposed deadline was I better get this done and sent over before I lost cell service, at Welch's or Rhododendron. And so I also alerted, I have an older brother who lives in Philadelphia, and I texted him and said, if you see anything in the Philadelphia Inquirer, let me know. We published it right before I got to the mountain.
Amazing.
And then I said, that's it, everyone. And luckily, other reporters assisted and provided and added to the story throughout the day with reaction and information from the Philadelphia.
And you still hit the slopes that day.
Yes, still hit the slopes. Not enough snow, but it was great. Sunny bluebird day.
Well, that's sometimes, what happens in the biz when news breaks. You gotta scramble.
Yeah, I was glad I had a chance to get my laptop before I got in the car, so I was able to at least get the story up.
That's kind of an amazing backstory. But what legacy do you think Chief Danielle Outlaw leaves behind here in Portland?
Well, she was only here 2 years and 2 months. I feel like she was still trying to settle in, and she spoke about the importance of 21st century policing, which is a buzzword you hear, a lot. But she was she spent like the first 6 months or so trying to learn the department and the bureau and come up with a command staff she felt comfortable with. And then she also was learning all the requirements of the DOJ settlement, which required changes to police bureau policies, training, oversight. And I think she had a lot of contacts nationally, so she used those. She brought in outside trainers to train officers on de-escalation. She also was pushing for an officer wellness program where officers could, to ensure that, that they dealt with the stress that they faced on the job day to day. So I think she was in the process of putting things and programs in place. And I mean, her biggest marching order, as she called it, from Mayor Wheeler was to improve the community's trust in the police bureau. And a lot of her, first year was just trying to meet people and get to know people. So I feel like, she was still feeling her way here and hadn't yet established a strong footing.
It's hard to build trust in 2 years,
yes, yes.
When you're talking about some of the issues. You mentioned the DOJ settlement that was regarding how officers treated mentally ill Portlanders, right?
People with mental illness.
Yeah.
And it also showed the excessive use of tasers against suspects who weren't putting up any resistance. So it revamped policies on use of force. It required additional training and also community oversight.
When Chief Outlaw was hired, I mean, she's got a great name for law enforcement, and she's a striking figure and a woman of color. It was it seemed like a big deal at the time, right, when she was hired.
Yeah, I think it was a monumental move. The mayor took time. He did a national search. He interviewed some 30 or so finalists. Community panels were engaged in interviewing finalists and making recommendations. And then once she was named, her swearing-in ceremony was at the Oregon Historical Society. There was a civil rights exhibit at the time, and she purposely held the swearing-in ceremony there and noted the history of Oregon. And she said, we can't improve unless we're familiar with the problems here, the racial discrimination, and that was a big change for
it's
Portland.
Not the Justice Center, right?
No.
Yeah. What do you think? You've covered a lot of chiefs, Max. What will you remember most about Chief Outlaw?
She told you what she was thinking. There was not a lot of guesswork when you spoke to her. She spoke her mind. Even if she disagreed, she would acknowledge the disagreement, but she was polite about it, but she was blunt. And I don't think she liked, and she was still getting used to some of the passive aggressiveness in this city and among politicians and the city council. And she always said she's not a politician. She just sort of wanted to lead the bureau, lead and learn. She was, very great in front of people and speaking, and she had a presence about her that was more commanding than some of the past chiefs. And so, I like that. She was, a petite lady, but very strong, leading this bureau of nearly 1,000 officers. So I think she had so much potential here if she stayed, but obviously, this is, as the mayor described it, as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Philadelphia Police Department's the 4th largest in the country. It has significant problems, but, she's only 43.
Right. That's remarkable. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, and so now she tries to reshape that department, which, like you said, is facing its own slew of issues different than what we have here in Portland. How many chiefs have you covered while reporting at the Oregonian, Max?
I was looking back, and I started in '98 when Chief Charles Moose was head of the bureau, and so I think it's been 10 or 11 if you count. There's been interim chiefs who serve very few months, but I think Chief Resch would be the 11th chief since I started here at the Oregonian.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot of turnover. What do you make of, do you have a sense of whether that's normal, or is that just kind of, we've had a kind of a series of, Chief Outlaw was not involved in this, but some of her predecessors left for, various scandals.
Yeah, we had some crazy scandals. If you look back in the last 5 years, there's been 5 chiefs. And that's starting with Chief O'Day, who didn't last long after the controversy over his off-duty shooting of a friend on a camping trip. Then there was an interim, Donna Henderson. She was in place for a few months before Chief Marshman came on, and a lot of it, I think, the chiefs serve at the discretion of the mayor, the police commissioner, and that's, with each police commissioner, and there's changes in elections, I think they want to feel comfortable with whoever's at the top of the police bureau, and often, I think Mayor Wheeler came in, and Marshman was the chief, and I think there was a sense he wanted to appoint someone himself.
Yeah, so you mentioned the commissioner form of government, so there's a political system where it's really you're going to have a lot of chiefs because of that system potentially, because you're going to have political reasons behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I started in Hartford, Connecticut, and covered police there, and in other cities there's large police commissions where the chief reports to a commission. Here, you just report to the police commissioner, who's the mayor, who's, their tenure, they haven't, there's, I believe most of the
they've been first-term mayors, right?
Have been first-term.
One-term mayors, I should say.
One term, and so I think it reflects that.
At one point, then Mayor Adams kind of bucked trends, and Commissioner Saltzman was briefly the police commissioner, but I can't recall any other.
Right. That's true.
So pivoting, let's tell us about Chief Resch, Jamie Resch. Who is she?
So Jamie Resch is started with the Portland Police Bureau. She's an insider who started and was hired in what was called Operation 80, which was this large class in 1999. I believe that was when Chief Moose was still head of the Bureau. And she grew up, she said she's from Montana, but grew up in the Beaverton area.
Okay.
Went to Beaverton High and then to University of Portland. It was interesting yesterday in her first press conference. She said she planned to be a doctor. She majored in allied health services and psychology. And when that becoming a doctor for whatever reason didn't go through, she decided to apply to the police bureau, more not of any particular interest in criminal justice, but more out of a sense like, let's see if I can do this. I don't know. And she had no exposure to police work, she said, in the past.
It wasn't her family. She didn't come from a family of either law enforcement officers or service members or anything like that.
No, she didn't mention any of that. And so then as soon as she started, she said she loved it. She enjoyed the people that she worked with, and she really quickly rose through the ranks fairly quietly. Someone said it's odd that you don't know her name, after spending some 20 years in the Bureau.
Right.
She stayed under the radar, but yet she was selected when Outlaw served as chief and she was setting up her command staff. She chose Jamie Resch, who was a captain at the time at North Precinct, I believe, to be her assistant chief of investigations. And everyone at that time was like, whoa, that's pretty unusual. Usually a commander goes to the assistant chief. But I think Outlaw said at the time as well that she wanted to find people, supervisors in the Bureau who weren't just doing things to get their name known, but were doing it out of, a real sense of wanting to help others or improve the community. And so she saw in Jamie Resch a potential, young leader. And then she was assistant chief in May of 2018. And then when Bob Day, who was Outlaw's deputy chief, left and retired, she chose Resch to be her deputy chief, and that was just in May. So she's only been deputy chief for 8 months.
Wow. So it's both a rapid rise, but also like you mentioned, she's been in it for more than 2 decades. Some of these leaders in the Bureau maybe are more visible, I guess, right, before they rise to those ranks. I mean,
usually they're like they're head of a precinct. They're a precinct commander,
right,
and they may have more interaction with the media at the scene or on
right,
some issues that crop up. She was a captain in the precinct. I mean, she worked on the gun task force. I think she was a crime analyst for tactical operations. I mean, she was active, and she was a lieutenant at East Precinct,
mm-hmm,
but she wasn't as well known, or her face might have been well known, but her name wasn't as well known to the public.
Yeah. So what did you learn when talking to some of her colleagues or people who have known or seen her work through the years? What did you learn about her?
I heard she's very meticulous and very humble, that she is not out there to gain the limelight, but she wants to get the work done. I heard one anecdote. This is from a retired commander, Wendy Steinbraun, who is now police chief in Washougal, Washington.
Mm-hmm.
She said, she remembered Jamie was a lieutenant at East Precinct, or sergeant at East Precinct, but she was newly in that role, and her whole night shift of officers were complaining about their assignments. And the next morning she came up with a solution where she, had each assignment on different pieces of paper and told officers to draw a slip. And that would be their shift for the night, their district for the night. And so she figured out a way to just deal with the complaining and get the work done.
Yeah.
She described her as no nonsense, meticulous, hardworking, smart, but over and over I heard that she is a collaborator. She wants to hear other people's viewpoints and thoughts more than some other higher supervisors might.
Well, and you actually had some interesting details that she's been very. It seems like very active for quite a while in both the refugee, making her presence known to the refugee community in Portland, as well as reaching out to various religious groups. She seems like she's just very proactive and likes talking to people.
Yeah, I've heard she was active in the Muslim Advisory Council as a member, and there's a Slavic Police Bureau Advisory Council, and also she worked after hours, after a full day of work, she would show up at the Portland airport to welcome new refugees who were coming into the city. There was Catholic Charities has a refugee resettlement program, and the woman who served as director there said Jamie was just, wonderful. She would text her, such and such families coming in at, a certain time. It was usually late, after 8 p.m. And she would show up in her uniform initially. Some in Catholic Charities or others were concerned that law enforcement was showing up, that it might frighten the new refugees. But the director of this program really wanted to change the viewpoint that refugees have of law enforcement. And from the get-go, she said, Jamie would just ask, what can I do? And pick up their luggage and help bring it to their cars, and really try to assist, and and also serve as an example to other officers and encourage them to go as well and do the same. So,
well, it'll be interesting if she continues that from the top seat.
Yeah, she said she hopes. I mean, she saw how she was close to Chief Outlaw, and she didn't expect to be chief so quickly. And so, but she got to watch Outlaw very closely, and she said, Outlaw seemed to strike immediate bonds with people when she met them, and she's hoping that her familiarity with the city and might help her form these community bonds quicker.
You mentioned it. She didn't expect to be chief so quickly. Mayor Wheeler went and did an extensive national search for Chief Outlaw, as you mentioned, but Mayor Wheeler hired Chief Resch pretty quickly. Were you surprised by that decision?
I think Wheeler was surprised by Outlaw leaving. And I think, the mayor's office has said, I think they wanted a smooth transition. He explained his reasons for not doing a full search, even though he's facing some criticism for it, but they make sense. I mean, he said there's a lot going on in the police bureau right now. They're starting negotiations with the police union this month. It's budget prep right now, starting these next few months. And the DOJ settlement, they're trying to, get sort of the court's approval that they're in compliance with the huge number of requirements they must meet. So I think he was looking for a smooth transition. And the way Chief Outlaw set up the command staff was fairly different than most chiefs had, at least in Portland. She said she came to Portland and she thought she would be able to bring her own deputy chief. And when she got here, she learned that wasn't going to happen because there had to be council approval for a new position and budgeting for it. And the person she wanted to bring wasn't going to wait for that. So, but anyway, they ended up setting up a deputy chief position, and she saw that position as more of the running the day-to-day operations of the bureau. And that's what Jamie was doing for the last 8 months. So I think the mayor saw that as, well, that made sense. She's familiar. She's from the bureau. Who knows? You could have got criticism again, bringing someone from the outside who's going to leave in 2.5 years.
And the mayor faces a re-election this year as well.
Another big question mark. If he's not going to be around, then who's going to, how's he going to attract someone? Not saying he's not going to be around, but...
Yeah, it's another variable. So,
right.
Well, let's take a break and come back and talk about some of the challenges that Chief Resch faces and just what's going on at the Bureau. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see facing the Police Bureau?
Well, I don't think they've had the number of vacancies that they have now. It is a pretty significant staffing shortage. Plus, they're facing added retirements this year, and they're having trouble recruiting new officers. So it is impairing their ability on patrol or in investigations. So that's a huge struggle. They've had a struggle to hire for many years because they would their hiring process would be dormant for a few years and they'd have to start all over, and they've that's not been the case the last few years, but they still are having many more vacancies. I think there's about 101 or 104 vacancies currently. Their authorized strength is 1,001. So they're trying to, Chief Resch said they're trying to speed up the background hiring process so people aren't waiting a year to find out if they've made it onto the Bureau or not, but cut that down to 6 months. So that's a huge struggle. And then, I heard this morning in a work session, they're just trying to figure out where to put the officers they do have. And with traffic fatalities, as you know,
right. 49 people died back in 2019.
Right, which is more than the homicides for the year, which were 36. They showed a graph with the number of traffic officers have gone down from year to year, and police contend that that's also contributing to the problems. Contributing to the problems
of traffic fatalities, yeah, because there's
less
not
enforcement.
Yeah, it's right when you're talking about 75 to 100 fewer officers than you're used to. It doesn't. You just driving around town, I don't see cops very often. It's just kind of the nature of the city today.
Right.
What do you hear when you're talking to either people in the command structure or the rank and file? Like, what's morale like in the Bureau?
I think people are behind Chief Resch. I think her officers, the other commanders, rank and file, have always felt she's risen quickly, but they feel she's qualified. So I think they like that stability and not having to go through another search and not knowing who's going to take over again.
Right.
So the familiarity is more settling for them. I don't think officers are surprised that Chief Outlaw went to a bigger city. I mean, she's been active in national associations, and so I think they kind of expected this would be a stepping stone. But in the last few years, a lot of the veteran officers, they hit 50 years old, 25 years on the Bureau, and they leave. They retire. They usually get jobs elsewhere.
Yeah.
But you see fewer and fewer veteran officers sticking around longer, where in years past they would.
Do you get a sense of why from some of the people that you talk to?
Well, what I hear is, a lot of officers complaining about the political climate in the city. It's not, also nationally, there's more scrutiny of law enforcement
right.
and less support. So I hear that is a big factor.
When you say political climate, Max, do you mean the city council dynamics, or do you mean the kind of warring street culture that we've had here with Antifa and Patriot Prayer?
I think it's both.
Yeah.
I think it's both. I think they've, the whole that one controversy regarding the crowd control lieutenant who was texting with Patriot Prayer's Joey Gibson. And once those text messages became public, there was quick assertions by the mayor and other city commissioners basically deriding the lieutenant for these text messages and saying they were way too friendly and chatty before any investigation had been done. So
right.
that really destroyed morale in the Bureau. And
this was an officer his job was to reach out to these various groups, right?
Right. Part of intelligence gathering is trying to establish some rapport with people you're trying to learn about. Doesn't mean necessarily you support them. It's just like source development, for
in journalism,
example.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, so that, and then there was a community listening session, which further disturbed the officers, which prompted the mayor and Chief Outlaw to hold listening sessions with officers at the precincts. So that was a low point for police officer morale. And, I've heard from officers outside of Portland who said that you couldn't pay them to work in Portland, which is horrible to say and think. But, I think this commission form of government also isn't easy for a chief of police who wants to get things done. But yet, she wanted to make a deputy chief position, but she had to get support from the full council, not just the police commissioner, and funding for it. And, I know the police, sometimes sit at those council meetings wondering, what's the background, what's the familiarity, education of some of the commissioners who are all of a sudden deciding how to manage a police bureau.
Right, because they might report to, in most cases, the mayor, but the mayor is a weak mayor who can assign bureaus, but has to also build consensus with their 4 colleagues.
Right.
3 right now in the wake of Nick Fish's death. But okay, so you've talked about the DOJ settlement a couple different times. How important is that to how the Bureau operates?
Well, I think last year, there's a city hired compliance officer who evaluates how the Bureau is meeting the targeted requirements of this settlement. And it came out with a long report that said basically the Bureau's in substantial compliance with all of the all the requirements. And there's a community oversight group, which was hailed as like this big, unique part of the city settlement agreement with the Justice Department. And the initial group that met, COAB, it was called, Community Oversight Advisory Board, basically fell apart because there was just infighting and not great leadership. So Mayor Wheeler put together a second community group, and it's just getting underway. And they heard this report from the compliance officer describing how the police bureau was in substantial compliance with this settlement agreement, which started because police were using excessive force against people with mental illness. And they just looked at the reality that in 2019, there were 5 police shootings, the most since 2010. So, and at least 3 of the 5 who were shot and killed suffered from significant mental health problems. So the community group was very skeptical of the compliance officer's findings, saying, we want to see outcomes.
Right.
Until we see outcomes, they're not so sure, the training, the policies are making a difference.
Yeah, especially when, like you mentioned, 3 people die. That's 3 too many. What do you think? Looking back at some of the chiefs that you've covered, are there traits that make a successful chief?
So I like the chiefs who spoke their minds and stood up for themselves and weren't afraid to, maybe challenge the mayor, their boss, and just stand up for what they believe in. And I think the officers respect that as well. You couldn't have a thin skin, though, covering Charles Moose, because he'd scream and yell and rant at you if there was something he didn't like. But that's part of our job to listen to. I think it's tough. They are, Chief Outlaw said, I'm not a politician so many times to me, but if she wanted to get something passed, she needed to know how to work the city council and the mayor. You've got to be a strong leader. And not necessarily, there's been complaints that they're just following or listening, that the mayor's really running the show. So, I'm just looking back. There was Mark Croker, who came from outside, came from Los Angeles Police Department after Charles Moose. And it was Mayor Katz who hired him. And he brought in some of the LA, there was a lot of riot control clad officers. I think even I recall it, New Year's Eve celebrations downtown to try to keep the peace.
Okay.
Which I don't think Portland was ready, wanted or... Anyway, I think he got into the crosshairs with Mayor Katz and he was gone. Then Derek Foxworth, who came from inside the department but had some really bad choices. He just had an inappropriate relationship with
one of his assistants, right?
With a staff member, desk clerk. So he was gone. And then Chief Rosie Sizer, I think she tried hard, and it just shows there is a political element to being chief, because her successor was Mike Reese, who was very tied to Randy Leonard, a city commissioner, and she got tossed when, on a budget issue. Mike Reese was appointed, and...
we skipped over Mayor Tom Potter, who was also a police chief, right?
Right. I wasn't... He was... When I came, he was no longer chief, but he was... I think Potter was mayor when Sizer was chief.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
So there's just been so many names. It's hard to keep track, honestly.
It's unsettling for officers who are trying to do their work there. And, I know a lot of officers like working night shift or outside of Central Precinct, so they, don't have to be bombarded with this constantly changing leadership landscape.
What will you be keeping an eye on in 2020 in terms of the police bureau, obviously with the new chief at the helm, but is there anything in particular you're keeping an eye on?
The year started with a great number of shootings, not necessarily homicides, but and shootings not, in areas where there hadn't been in Northwest Portland.
Mm-hmm.
So I think how the bureau tries to get a handle on the gun violence, the police shootings, whether those will decrease or not, whether and a big issue is the new Portland Street response, which doesn't necessarily fall on my beat, but it affects police.
This is the effort to have non-police officers respond to homeless camps and things of that nature, right?
Or people in mental health crisis where officers acknowledge they're not the best suited for those kind of calls. I know there's a pilot project planned, but Chief Outlaw said that's not, and others have said that's a small part. That's not going to be sufficient to handle the number of calls. So looking at what else is going to be done in that area. And there's been just so long I've been writing about the plan to bring body worn cameras to police. And it's been, I remember Charlie Hales was talking about this. Yeah, I was going to say,
I was covering the Hales administration at the time, and they were talking about this, and that was 6 years ago.
Right, which is remarkable. Gresham, I think, just put body cameras on their officers. Mm-hmm. Here, I know there's some reluctance among council members.
Yeah.
And
then it's also a federal election, given the last 3+ years of clashes on the streets here in Portland. What can we expect for a police bureau under Chief Resch in terms of how they respond?
Chief Resch actually signaled in her first press conference to expect more of the collaboration and assistance of outside agencies for Portland police when they deal with large protests, especially in this election year, which they, are expecting. And so seeking assistance from other law enforcement agencies to bolster their numbers.
So reinforcements on the streets, I guess. Well, there's going to be a lot to look forward to and keep track of, as always, and a new chief as well. Thanks for sharing your insight, Max.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. Read Max's profile of Jamie Resch in the episode notes or on OregonLive.com. Check out my stories on the transportation beat at OregonLive.com/commuting. Catch up on past episodes by subscribing to Beat Check anywhere you listen to podcasts. A reminder to please leave us a rating and review to help us spread the word. It helps others find the show. Until next time.